The Imperative of Desire by Elena Graf. Chapter 12. Daphne. Daphne changed her tune over the summer months. Someone had told her that on my 18th birthday I would come into a sizable fortune. From the same source, she discovered that I was to inherit a title, several in fact, something I never discussed in England. Since arriving at Oxford, I had scrupulously kept to my father's advice about getting on, but now my plan was completely foiled. Daphne began boasting about our friendship, including the salient details, to everyone. Soon all of Lady Margarethe Hall knew all about it. I tried to avoid the place when I could. I wish I could say that I had a healthy skepticism about Daphne's sudden transformation from a bored snob to my dearest friend, but I was besotted and saw only what I wished to see. All I knew was that she was paying me the attention I craved. To be fair, she wasn't simply an opportunist who wished to take advantage of a wealthy friend. Once we got to know one another, we found we had much in common. Our collaboration began with studying together. I had read most of the titles in the Great Books program, so I could easily provide her with notes off the top of my head. This saved her an immense amount of time. We spent some of the free time down in London, where we haunted the museums. I loved the collections of the British Museum, even more than those of the Altes Museum in Berlin. My fascination with archaeology and classical sculpture went back to my grandfather's tales of the heroic Schliemann, who had excavated at Mycenae in search of the treasures of ancient Troy. My grandaunt had only fueled my passion with her focus on classical literature. Daphne and I read the poems of Sappho together. To be sure, these amazing works were not on the list of great books, and despite their innocuous content, were considered slightly obscene, certainly not fit for young women. Many people confuse the extant writings of Sappho with a notorious pseudo-translation by Pierre Louis entitled The Songs of Bilitis. Those poems were truly erotic and quite scandalous. We read those too. But I loved to hear Daphne read classical Greek. She had a rich, melodic voice with perfect modulation and cadence. "Do you suppose that Sappho really had female lovers?" I asked, as I lay on the divan in Daphne's sitting room after a particularly stirring rendition. "Of course she had, you goose. Hasn't every woman?" I sat up and stared at her. "Have you?" She smiled slyly. "I thought you'd never ask." Whereupon she pushed me back on the divan and began to kiss my mouth. Stupidly, I lay there with my jaw locked tight. Daphne sat up and laughed. "You are such a child, Meg. I'll wager you haven't been with a man either." Of course I hadn't. My youth suddenly seemed a huge liability. "You need someone to teach you a few things." She reached under my skirts and began to stroke the inside of my thigh. I was so startled I never thought to protest. "One thing you must learn is a woman requires a very careful approach, very gentle, something like this." She began to stroke me through my undergarments and again tried to kiss me. I closed my eyes and let the delicious stroking transport me to another place. It was interrupted by her rising to lock the doors. I felt a sudden chill as she moved away. When she returned, she unbuttoned her blouse and slipped out of her skirt. While she worked the buttons on my blouse, she kissed me in the strangest way. All the kissing I had ever done had been dry and contained, so when Daphne pressed her tongue against my lips, I had no idea what to do. "Open up," she encouraged gently. I instantly obeyed, and she began to explore my mouth with her tongue. Naturally, I was quite surprised by both the nature of the activity and the sensations it was arousing in me. Her saliva had a completely neutral taste, except for a hint of lemon from the drops she liked to suck on while she studied. "Now come, love, sit up and help me a little. This ought to be a mutual thing." I obediently sat up and helped her undress me. Modestly, we retained our undergarments. She drew the coverlet over us, leaned on her elbow, and gazed into my eyes. "You are quite beautiful. Has anyone ever told you so?" I could barely think to form words. I managed to mumble, "No, never." This wasn't completely true. Veronica told me this often because she wanted me to think so, but I never believed it. "You look so perfectly Prussian. Quintessentially so," said Daphne. "So blonde and blue-eyed, heroic like a Valkyrie. You should sing Wagner." She stroked my hair. "Now, my dear, I am going to touch you. Tell me if you like it." The amazing stroking began again, but this time Daphne reached inside my pantaloons and touched my bare sex. I thought I would leap out of my skin. "Ah," she said, "you are quite ready. Can you feel how wet you are?" Actually, I could also hear it. "I suppose you know from your physiology studies the purpose of all this wonderful moisture." I did not, and stupidly admitted it. Daphne proceeded to explain to me the role of the moisture in easing the sexual act between a man and a woman. She described it quite clinically, yet listening to her beautiful voice tell me such things excited me all the more. Now here we go. When I felt her fingers move into my body, I thought I would faint from the pleasure. She continued in this vein, inside, then out, the stroking, measured, patient, gentle. Then suddenly, there it was, the climax. I knew exactly what it was because I had learned to pleasure myself at a young age. But this was very different because someone else was controlling the pace and the rhythm. Daphne went within again, and I experienced another climax. "Simply beautiful," she murmured and kissed me. She smiled with great satisfaction. "You have been an excellent pupil. Now let's see what you have learned." She lay down beside me, and I understood that I was to return the favor. So it began. Afterwards, we were inseparable. Daphne more or less moved into my apartment at Somerville because it was larger. We would spend hours in bed as she taught me everything she knew. When she described the mechanics of that most intimate kiss, I was quite sure I wouldn't like it. But again, I was surprised by the neutrality of the scent and the taste of my lover. Of course, being on the receiving end was the greatest pleasure imaginable. At term break, I went home to Adelheim. While we were apart, I simply ached for Daphne. I became so moody and introspective that Veronica looked quite concerned and asked me what was wrong. Of course, I couldn't share the reason for my pain. I wrote to Daphne every day without fail. Daphne was an equally faithful correspondent. I poured out my heart to her and wrote detailed descriptions of everything I experienced during the day. Sensibly, I had given up writing mediocre poetry and confined myself to journalistic observations. Our reunion after the holiday was accompanied by a joy that bordered on pain. We went to bed at once and didn't emerge for days. The trouble began soon after. Our lives outside the bedchamber began to disintegrate. Daphne's academic performance suffered, and her tutors were beginning to question the cause. Until then, she had been an outstanding student, in line for first honors. Fortunately, my studies gave me no troubles of this kind. My medical studies required that I present myself in the laboratory. However, I became more neglectful of my attendance at lectures, which angered my tutors. Although I was very careful to send notes ahead when I would be late or absent, this didn't mollify them, so I made the effort to tear myself away from Daphne. There were other signs of disturbance. When I finally took my horse out for a ride, I became aware of how I had neglected her. She pulled at the bit and fought my attempts to rein her in. Finally, something drew us back into the sunlight. The Opera Society was staging Ariodante. I finally got a major part in a student opera. I was cast in the title role and Daphne as the female lead. Playing the role of Daphne's beloved and kissing her on stage was ironic in so many ways, but it forced us to emerge from our darkened rooms. Even so, we were always groping one another whenever we thought we couldn't be seen. Then, after having been driven to a fever pitch, we would return to our rooms at the college, where we made love until we were exhausted. We would sleep a few hours, then recommence our impassioned embraces. But now I had a new obsession. Although I had performed in public at Chilton Hall and Oberroth, I had never sung the lead role in a fully staged opera. I was very excited, so excited I could barely sleep at night. I wrote to Sister Elfrida to tell her all about it, and she wrote back words of encouragement. Despite my delight, I was overwhelmingly anxious, convinced that I would step on the stage and forget it all. I made detailed annotated notes in the score and practiced incessantly. I rehearsed until I could sing every note of every bar of not only my part but all the others as well. On opening night, I experienced the profound stage fright that was to plague me for my entire life. I was counting measures, although it was only the overture and I would not appear on stage until the fifth scene. Our little student theater at Oxford was tiny, and in that week of May before the semester recess, stifling. Behind the last traveler, a ridiculously thick and opulent velvet, the gift of a moneyed Victorian-era alumna, it was hotter still. I was sweating profusely into my costume, as much from anxiety as the temperature. Daphne slipped into the space behind me and put her arms around my waist. "You look so very heroic, my Lord Prince," she whispered, rubbing my buttocks in a most suggestive way. Her hand slipped between my legs to caress my sex. I groaned with pleasure. I turned to kiss her, but she turned her head. "Don't ruin my makeup," I mumbled an apology. "Touch me instead," she said, taking my hand. Her costume for the role of Ginevra was deliciously sheer, and I could feel the nipple of her small breast pucker to my touch. Just then the stage manager cued Daphne and she slipped away. She walked on the stage with elegant little steps. She began to sing in a crisp soprano. She was one of the more talented among us. I was counting measures again when the director stepped behind the curtain. "Lord Ariodante," he said with a bow and a great flourish. Laughing at this ridiculous display never occurred to me. At my parents' home in Prussia, everyone addressed me as gnädige, or occasionally, if somewhat prematurely, Eure Liebdinnen. "Are you ready?" asked the director. "Not quite," I replied. He nodded. "You shouldn't worry. You'll be splendid. You have a superb voice, and you are completely convincing in the role." I studied him, trying to decide what he meant by that remark. "Are you saying I make a good man?" "Since you are asking, yes. You have just the right swagger. If he only knew how hard I'd practiced." He looked at me intently. "Is there something between you and Daphne Richardson?" I feigned surprise. "Why do you ask?" He leaned over to speak confidentially. I have eyes, but have no fear. I've been known to take a boy to my bed. Myself. I'd lost my count, and now the stage manager was cueing me. Ariodante in 15 bars. The director gave me an encouraging pat on the shoulder, man to man, and I tripped out on the stage. The music began to play. I stared out into the darkness and listened to the coughs and shuffles. The spotlight shone on me. Then the audience disappeared, and the stage. 1, 2, 3. I opened my mouth and entered the passage at exactly the right place.